Let's go.
Let's go. Oh, no.
Do you want to?
Sorry. I'll let you.
Next one.
I'm excited and I feel relaxed and I'm ready to party. Don't say sorry. You don't need to do that. You don't need to apologize. It's a fucked up female habit. You don't need to be sorry for anything ever.
Can you guess what every woman's worst nightmare is?
I don't have rage issues!
I have nothing to prove to you.
When I'm good, I'm very good. But when I'm bad, I'm better.
I say when it comes to stardom and Lauren, there are no accidents.
Hi, Karen Peterson.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Citizen Dame, the podcast where we're women and we love women. Women are very cool, and we're actually recording on International Women's Day, and it is Women's History Month. So, congratulations to all of us. I am Lauren Humphreys Brooks, and with me, as always, is Karen Peterson. Hello, Karen.
Hello.
Now you're an international woman, Karen. Like all women, we're all international women.
Yes.
How are you doing?
I'm doing okay. I'm doing pretty well. I didn't tell you this before we recorded, but this week, just speaking of women, an Eagle woman has been on my screen and screens all across America because we have these two eagles, American bald eagles, up in our mountains here, and they had their first babies.
Oh,
so exciting. They had 3 this week, and it's just been so fun. They've been trying for 3 years, and they finally did it.
yay. There is hope after all.
There is, and it's so cute because there's a live stream, and I've been watching it all week. And the third one just hatched yesterday.
Yay. I think I've heard about this, actually. Someone else I know was in California was like, our eagles are doing well. I was like, what the hell are you talking about?
That's what they're talking about.
Okay, there we go.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So before we get going on the first film in this Women's History Month series, Karen, you had some thoughts about last weekend's Oscars, which I kept forgetting about. Like, literally, I was reminded 3 separate times by different people that the Oscars were that weekend, and I kept each time I was like, oh yeah, the Oscars are this weekend. So that kind of indicates to me something, definitely. So what were your thoughts generally about the Oscars?
Well, first of all, I would just like to give a shout out to Disney and Hulu, who spent weeks promoting that they were doing it was the first time they were live streaming the Oscars, and that was great. It's finally time to move into this part of the 21st century where things stream now and not everything is broadcast TV. So that was cool. And then especially a shout out to them for fucking it up royally.
Oh no. Oh.
So first of all, a lot of us, myself included, were not able to get the live stream to start at all. We were just blocked out. It said live TV not available in your area. I'm like, no, you said you were going to stream this. So that was fun. I ended up having to pivot to restart my YouTube TV subscription just for like a limited thing. So I didn't end up having to pay. I was able to do it for free, but still I had to pivot, missed the first 20 minutes of the show. And then for anybody who was able to get the Hulu live stream, it was scheduled to go till 7:32, which was the runtime of the show, which of course it went long because it always does. And so right in the middle of the Best Actress presentation, which was the second to last award of the night, the stream ended.
Oh my God.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Do these people not know how the Oscars work? Like, first, it always runs long. It's never not run long in my memory.
No, I think there's one time that it ended on time.
And like what?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So
Wow.
A lot of people missed the last 15 minutes or so of the show.
Like the best picture.
Best actress and best picture. Yeah. Yeah. So good job, guys. Good job. But as for the show itself, the thing that was really weird this year was that, I had some films that I loved, and some of which were nominated for awards. Like Nosferatu was my favorite film of 2024. I really loved Maria, which was my favorite film of 2024 until Nosferatu came out. And then, The Substance, which did get nominated for Best Picture and Best Director, which I knew it wasn't going to win either of those. It ended up winning makeup and hairstyling. I cannot believe Demi Moore did not win, but I also can totally believe it. Because Mikey Madison winning for Anora over Demi Moore was like basically the plot of The Substance. But yeah.
Welcome to Hollywood.
Oh yeah, exactly. But the thing is, it was such a weird year, and I think this speaks to kind of why you kept forgetting it was even happening. Is for myself, most of the movies, the big movies that were nominated, Anora, The Brutalist, I liked Conclave a lot, but those were kind of the big three. Wicked also had a lot of nominations, but I knew that didn't feel like it was going to win Best Picture. And so it's like, you have these movies where people liked them, but there wasn't a ton of passion behind almost anything nominated. So it made the whole ceremony overall, like, it was a fine ceremony. Conan O'Brien did a good job as the host. I'm so glad white men in Hollywood are finding work. Such a relief.
We've been really worried about them. We've been really worried about them in the country. We're so fucking concerned about the white men in like the country right now. It's
good news. White men are back. Not that they went anywhere. But no, but really though, Conan O'Brien did do a good job. It's a thankless job. And it's, you're gonna have people who hate you no matter what you do. And he did as good of a job as anybody could have. And I think that and this was his first time hosting, and I think that he was a good Oscar host. He kept the show moving. He kept it, relevant. He reacted to things in real time in very like courteous ways. It didn't feel mean spirited at all. I like Jimmy Kimmel, but sometimes his humor feels very mean, because he's friends with everybody. And so he knows where the buttons are, and so, but yeah, like, because people liked a lot of movies, but they weren't super passionate about most of them. The whole night just felt kind of like, okay, all right, cool. On to the next, it really does make a difference. So it didn't feel like a huge celebration so much as a inevitability in the end. Like, going into the night, it seemed like probably Anora would do well, but there was still a lot of questions, and then it did, and it's just like, yeah, all right, cool.
Well, I mean, that's the thing. Like, the most intense discussion around films this year felt like it was around Emilia Perez, which was not positive, right? Like, and all kinds of problems. Like, and in fact, most of the people outside of like the film community that I've talked to about the Oscars, that was the one that they kept on bringing up, because just like, so what the hell is going on with that? Like, I don't understand. Like, talking about all of the various controversies and questions and everything. And that's the thing. I mean, I've not been really excited for the Oscars for a couple of years. But like, I felt like there was more, interesting stuff that could happen. And this year, like, even, some of the stuff that you're talking about, I'm like, okay, all of these films I'd kind of like to see. Like, I really liked Conclave. I liked Wicked. I wasn't like overly in love with it or anything, but it's a well-made musical. The films that I did love are stuff like The Substance and Nosferatu, which I wouldn't expect to get tons of awards particularly. But the other films like Anora, it's like, okay, I'd like to see that. Yeah, sure. The Brutalist, yeah, maybe I'll see that at some point. But that's the thing. It was a lot of sort of, okay, not negative, but just sort of, well, I don't feel like I need it,
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that energy just wasn't there at all for me. And it seems like that's true for a lot of people. And it seems like that's even true for the awards themselves.
Yeah. Well, and you actually bring up a really important point about what was happening this year, because I was on Blue Sky, I guess posting, I don't know what the word is. It's not tweeting for sure. But I was on Blue Sky. I was reading other people's posts. I was sharing my thoughts as the show was going. And it was really interesting because a lot of the talk centered around people just being glad every time Emilia Perez didn't win an award, instead of being excited for what did win.
Well, and that's unfortunate, because you don't want the entire conversation around an award show to be the as long as this one movie doesn't get it, you know?
Yeah.
Like that's depressing in a lot of ways because it's just very
Yeah.
negative. Whereas in previous
It
years,
really
like with
is.
Jane Campion, it's like, oh yeah, Jane Campion. All right, I'm excited about that. You know, that kind of thing is a lot more when you're, you know, when you're actually rooting for something, you're like, these are some really great films, and I will be interested to see who wins, et cetera. And there have been some great films released in the past year, some of them which were nominated, but there hasn't been that, like, Hollywood honestly is feeling more and more out of step with reality.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
seems a lot more complacent right now, and even complacent in terms of the actual cinematic landscape, where there's a lot of stuff happening at the peripheries, but Hollywood itself is getting increasingly boring, and that includes the films that are being released as quote important films.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, what's really interesting is with the top 3 film, like feature film awards being, or I guess 4, being Best Picture, Animated Feature, International Feature, and Documentary Feature. So those 4 awards that recognize a feature film in total. You have Anora, which was bought by Neon, not produced by them. They did not make that movie; they bought it, but it was made for $6 million. And then you have Flow, which is from Latvia. It's the first film Latvia has won an award for. It was the animated feature winner, released by Janus Films, which is a very, you know, it's still a pretty niche studio. And then you have No Other Land, which is the documentary feature from Palestine. Well, it was co-produced by an Israeli and a Palestinian person. They worked together on it. And seeing those two, the best moment of the night to me was those two accepting the award together on stage and calling for an end to the genocide. It was really a powerful moment. And it was interesting watching how everybody in the room did not know how to react to that. But the other interesting thing about it is that No Other Land wins an Oscar without US distribution. They did that themselves. Nobody was pushing that film, and it still does not have a US distributor. So if you do happen to get a chance to watch it, take that chance, because who knows, like, how often that's going to happen, you know?
Yeah,
And
I know that it's been playing at Film Forum in New York, and I think they may have extended the run again, but it was like sold out screenings basically because it's so difficult to see right now.
Yeah, here in Southern California, in the LA area, it's been playing at the Laemmle theaters. But like for me, it did play at the one near my house, but it was like only available on Saturday mornings for a few weeks at 10:30 in the morning. So it's been very difficult to find. And even after winning an Oscar a week ago, that didn't change things. You know, it's still people are just scared of this movie, and it's such a good film. And then you have I'm Still Here from Brazil, which also had a very limited release in the United States. And so these 4 films are so outside of the Hollywood mainstream, and those are the ones that ended up winning. And it's just interesting.
I think that's good.
I think it is too. But it's all, and also this was a 5-year high for Oscar viewership, which is even more interesting.
I mean, it's a good thing. Like, I'm glad to hear that. It's just I don't know how to describe it exactly. There's a weird disconnect that's happening. It's like, and maybe it's that, you know, the Oscars and like kind of the Hollywood mainstream as an entity, right, are getting increasingly disconnected from the films that are actually getting made and even winning Oscars, like you're saying. That like there's a split happening, there's a divide happening, that, and you know, maybe it's just that these kinds of award shows are just not the way that, you know, they're not the direction that cinema is going to go. Like I say, there's a lot of really interesting stuff happening in cinema, but it's not happening within the mainstream. And so like there's a shift coming. We've talked about this before. There's a shift coming in, and it's happening already, really. in Hollywood and in filmmaking generally. And it's going to be interesting to see how it all shakes out.
Yeah, we've been on a tipping point for a while, and I feel like we're tipping now. Like it's happening.
Yeah. So
that's the Oscars.
That's the Oscars. All right. Well, we're going to talk about a film that did not win any Oscars, and a director that did not win any Oscars. However, the film that we're talking about was selected by the Library of Congress in 2016 for preservation because it is culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant. So this month, we wanted to talk about a very underseen female filmmaker, underseen, and yet most of us have seen at least one of her films. Probably maybe when we were too young to really understand them, or maybe we were old enough and just didn't get it. But we're going to talk about Penelope Spheeris, who has had one of the oddest careers, honestly. But has made some like really fascinating films, some very like actually surprisingly influential films. And the first one we want to talk about with her is her first feature film, which is called The Decline of Western Civilization, which is a great title for a documentary about the punk rock movement of the late 70s and early 80s in LA specifically. So this film was filmed through 1979 and 1980 and focuses on the Los Angeles punk rock scene, particularly hardcore punk. So these are like the really down and dirty bands. And this was the first appearance, definitely in mainstream cinema, of a lot of these bands, some of whom, like probably if you know a little bit about punk rock, you probably have heard of at least a couple of them. And what's really interesting about this is that it's kind of a concert film and that you get a lot of songs, a lot of performances from the bands. And then Spheeris like talks to audience members, punks themselves, the bands, some of the promoters, some of the writers who cover the punk scene, and really gets into like kind of the down and dirtiness of the punk rock scene in that period. And yeah, I find it to be a really fascinating film. And she made an entire series of these films. There's two more: The Decline of Western Civilization Part 2, The Metal Years, which focuses on the heavy metal scene. And is not, I will say it's an interesting film, and it is not as like in depth as the first film or the third one. And I think that part of that is because the heavy metal scene feels a lot more superficial. It's a lot more like aesthetic versus, you know, this very real disaffection that comes through in the punk documentaries. The third film, which I really recommend people watch, is The Decline of Western Civilization Part 3, which is later, considerably later in the late 90s, and kind of focuses much more on the lifestyle of gutter punks, people who've like completely removed themselves as far as possible from society. And it's very sad, but it's also fascinating and very poignant and a beautifully made film. So I really honestly watch all of them. They're a lot of fun, and they're very interesting, especially looking at these kind of, you know, very fringe subcultures.
Yeah.
And they're all right now available on the Criterion Channel, by the way. So first of all, like, was this the first time you'd seen The Decline of Western Civilization, Karen?
It was. I knew about it. I've known about these films for a long time, but I had never actually sat down and watched them.
So what did you think? In watching this, what were you expecting going into it, and what did you think about it as you watched it? I guess I'm just curious.
So not having been a really big fan of punk, especially late 70s, early 80s, it's one of those things where it's like I'm aware of it. I've experienced some of that music, but that wasn't my scene, I guess. But I feel like the film was kind of exactly what I expected it to be in a way. Maybe because I just knew enough about it to kind of just, you know, it really showcases a lot of the film, or like a lot of the music and the bands actually just performing their music, but it also has people commenting on kind of the era, interviewing the band members, but also journalists, and people who were really invested in that era and that time. And so I feel like as a documentary about this subject, I feel like in some ways it's kind of made in a straightforward way, but the topic itself is not straightforward at all. So so overall it was really interesting. It was like such a fun kind of snapshot of this time period. And just listening to some of the things people were saying, being a little bit surprised by some of the symbols that I was seeing. I was just like, oh, okay.
Yeah, let's talk about that in a minute. This issue of right-wing elements within the punk community, because and that's something that's very much, there's a divide there that exists. And if you listen to particularly like bands like Black Flag and like the Dead Kennedys, they who are much more on the left-wing side.
Right.
But
those are the ones that I know the best. So
yeah, well, and they're the ones that, some of them are the ones that survived. So like the Germs, who Darby Crash, who I think is some of the most memorable performances in Decline of Western Civilization, because they're so like almost non-existent, like they're barely playing music. They're barely playing instruments. You know, you've got Darby Crash who talks about getting incredibly wasted before he goes on stage, on like all kinds of different drugs, and then he's screaming, he's like, you know, fighting with people in the audience, they're drawing on him, he's, you know, cutting himself up literally on stage. That band did not survive very long, and I think that actually Darby Crash himself died of an overdose before the documentary was even released.
And he ended up on the poster of for the film. So
yeah, he's on the cover, just like lying on the stage, covered in like drawings that the audience has done on him. But so like you've got a number of these bands that didn't survive, or because their members literally died, or, you know, changed so much over the course, they or never even made it into the mainstream. So bands like Dead Kennedys and Black Flag, and Dead Kennedys are not featured in this documentary, but bands like Black Flag, which changed a lot over the years, but they did survive. They're known. They became a little bit more mainstream. They became kind of the poster childs for punk. Whereas you've got other bands like Germs that just, you know, they, in a lot of ways, they're immortalized because of this film.
Right.
So it's interesting. Like, what I really like in rewatching this movie is the fact that Spheeris is present in the film as the filmmaker, and you hear her voice a number of times, asking questions, and kind of guiding the conversation. But she's very non-invasive in a lot of ways, and the film itself is very non-judgmental. So you're depicting this subculture, right? That's a very young subculture in a lot of ways. These guys are all teenagers and in their 20s, and is a very reactive subculture. It's reacting to kind of the world around them, but she's not judging them. Go on.
Yeah, well, I was just gonna say, I think we should kind of talk about where the world is at this time, and how this movement kind of rises up, because these kids were definitely old enough to be aware of what was happening in Vietnam, just 10 years before, and they would have had probably not parents, but probably older siblings, cousins, maybe uncles that had gone to Vietnam. And so they, you know, the civil rights movement and all of the things, you know, everything that was happening throughout the 60s and into the 70s, they would have been very aware of that, but also of an age where they couldn't participate and they couldn't do anything. And then there's this swing. We have all these political shifts happening, and you know, in 1980, Ronald Reagan gets elected president, and these folks, these kids, they were they were not in any sort of a position to really have a voice, and they acted out in whatever way they could. And that is where you start to get the rise of the punk movement. And so I think that so much of what we're seeing in this documentary is reflecting just where America was, and sort of their reaction to not being able to their reaction to being acted upon rather than being able to act.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, so punk has been around really since the early 70s as like a movement. And it went through a number of different changes, and particularly the Los Angeles hardcore punk scene was rising up right there at the end of the 70s. And there's a couple of points actually where I think it's in one of the performances, maybe by like the Circle Jerks, where I love saying these band names. Like the Circle Jerks, you know.
Yeah.
Where like one of them starts shouting, because audience members start fighting, right? And one of them starts shouting like, "Oh, it's like Altamont, Summer of Love, man!" Like, so they're referencing things that happened, 10 years ago. So they're talking about Altamont, where if you know what Altamont was, it was a Rolling Stones and a number of different bands. It was kind of it became sort of the symbol for the death of the 60s, because the Rolling Stones hired the Hells Angels to do security for them, and they wound up
which went very well.
Yeah, which went exactly as you would expect. They wound up getting drunk, beating up members of the audience. A couple of people died. Like it was meant to be this like, oh, the kind of West Coast Woodstock, and it turned into this like symbol of the death of the 60s. And so you've got kids, 10 years later, a little bit more than 10 years later, making reference to this and being like, oh yeah, look at what's happening. Look at the death of the 70s in some ways. At these shows that encourage violence in a lot of ways, encourage this anger that is just coming out not only on stage, but in the audience. And one of the interesting points, I think, in the film is that the film does go a little bit into not just the music, but the subculture of it, and this whole concept of pogo dancing, and how, bouncers being talked to about like, how can you tell the difference between when a fight is an actual fight that you need to break up, and when it's just these kids dancing and like wanting to be violent with each other, and no one seems to like draw a conclusion about it either. It's just like, we just kind of know, right? But you have this like this narrowing of, first of all, the relationship between the band and the audience, and this narrowing of like, what is violence, what is music, what is dancing and having a good time, and what is just beating the shit out of other people. And I think that you're right. I think it's very indicative of the place that the United States is in the late 70s and the early 80s, and that disaffection and like you say, that sense of not being able to have any effect, being young, not being able to have any effect on the world around you, feeling like you've been failed by everything. And it's like, well, what's the last thing to do? Well, go to a concert, scream your head off, and beat the shit out of people. So let's talk about the symbols that are used. Because one of the things that is kind of the dichotomy within punk rock is that punk rock is formed and becomes kind of popular within youth subculture as a rebellion, right? It's a rebellion. It's rebellion. It's anti-establishment. It's against the man, whoever the man happens to be. The man, by the time you get to 1979, is the way that these punks are talking is the hippies, right? It's the, oh, it used to be all peace and love. Well, it's not that anymore kind of thing. And so there is this reactionism that is popping up in, and you see it in the concert footage. You see it in some of the lyrics of like, that's very right wing. That's very like Nazi. I mean, you get Nazi symbols running around. You get people wearing iron crosses and swastikas.
Yeah. Or drawing swastikas on themselves. Yeah.
Well, and part of the question within that is like, is this just sort of a is it just is this sort of like a simply a reaction to whatever the prevailing viewpoint is? It's a shock factor, right? Or does this actually go deeper? Because there is something incredibly nihilistic about a lot of this music and a lot of this subculture.
Yeah. I think it's some of both. I don't think that there's one answer for everybody, because I think that so many of the kids that participated in this, world, had a lot of different reasons for it, and I mean, you just have such a big cross section of experiences. And so I think you definitely do have some that were like skinheads, Aryan Nation type of things like that. That's definitely, I remember when I was a kid, being out somewhere with my mom and my brother and seeing these young, I mean, they seemed old to me because I was like 6, but these young people that had, the mohawks, and or some people had their heads shaved and things, and they were definitely part of the punk scene. And my mom was just like, don't look directly at them, because I don't want them to come over and bother us. And it's like, okay. And I noticed, and I didn't know what it was at the time, but it's so burned in my memory, but I noticed one of them was wearing a necklace that had a swastika on it. And so years later, I was like, I just want to understand more about that. And yeah, so you did have a range of ideologies. You had some that were very intentionally, part of that neo-Nazi group. And then you had others that, to them, it was just like a symbol of rebellion. Like, I know this is wrong, so I'm going to just put it in your face just so that you'll react to it, So it's, and that, just like with the fighting, it's hard to know like who really means it and who doesn't, who's just trying to draw attention, And then you have kind of the other end too, like you say, where there's people that are very much as far removed from that as possible as well. So I think that's what's so fascinating about the punk culture is that there was a place for everything in the spectrum.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, you get to 1981, the Dead Kennedys release Nazi Punks Fuck Off, right? Which is they're sort of, I mean, if you ever hear it, it's basically like, you're not a real punk if you're a Nazi. Because the whole idea is about this being, anti-establishment, and that part of the whole point, the Nazis are the most establishment you could possibly get.
Right.
But I do think that there is this element of shock, right? That it's like you this desire, and that's one of the things that runs through a lot of the interviews that Spheeris does as well, is this desire to shock the mainstream, to shock your parents, basically, to frighten people. And sometimes it's thoughtful, right? It's more like, okay, what does this actually mean? And sometimes it's not thoughtful at all. It's just like, what's going to shock, the suburban white people the most? Shove a swastika in their face. That'll shock them. Right. But then you begin to get these more philosophical underpinnings of a lot of that. And a lot of these, if you listen to the interviews that she does, these are not stupid people. Like, these are not, I think that punk so often gets represented as being this sort of mindlessness at some level. It's just mindless violence. These kids know what they're feeling. And a lot of them are very intelligent about it, particularly the bands. And so that's where you begin to get into, it's just like, you can't say that you don't know what you're doing. But you also can't say that this is 100%, that this is like, I don't know how to put it, that it's, you can't say that you don't know what you're doing, but you also can't say that they are completely, cognizant of it. I'm trying to figure out how to say it.
It's like, I mean, we see kids do this now where it's like they know what they want to say, but they don't know how to say it right.
Yeah.
So they get it completely wrong. And, or not even necessarily completely wrong, but they get it a little wrong. And I think that's what we have happening here is, in some cases, like they're really angry. They want people to know how they feel. They want people to know they're angry, but then they go about it in a way that just makes everything worse.
Yeah, it's very deliberate, and it's and there's a combination of thoughtfulness and thoughtlessness. I don't know. It's interesting.
No, that's exactly right. And I mean, I've talked before, I work with college kids, and that's actually very normal for that age, where they are very thoughtful in certain things, but because they don't have the life experience or the vocabulary necessary to really convey those emotions that they're experiencing, and that, the frustration that they have.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes you end up with some miscommunication.
Well, and it also highlights kind of the danger of that. Like, a lot of the people, particularly the audience members, so the kids, the people who are just following these bands, a lot of them are talking about, the sense of like, I'm just angry. I'm just, like, I just want to go out. I just want to go out and have a good time. And if that means, beating up my friends, then that's what I'm going to do. Right. It's that energy that is an angry energy, and that is needs to be directed somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, I think one of the kids that she interviews actually basically says that it's just like, I'm just aggressive and I need to get it out.
Right.
And then you get a little bit of backstory, and it's like some of these kids who've grown up in very sort of pristine suburban spaces and are sick of it. Kids that have grown up in bad sort of situations that, they're just like, this is the only way I can express myself in any way. But it does speak to this generation that has been failed in some way. It definitely feels like they've been failed. And want to do something where, just like it's kind of like, you just don't get it. And it's hard to get it. And I think that the documentary does a very good and honest job of representing that, and not judging them for it particularly, just kind of showing it.
Yeah, I think that, and I think that makes sense for Spheeris in general, and especially at the beginning of her career.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, she grew up kind of in interesting circumstances, and she is from Orange County, California. You and I were talking about this before we started recording. She's from Orange County, but she's from a part of Orange County that's not the part that people necessarily have like these big, ideas about. And she grew up in she graduated from Westminster High School, which is not in a fancy part of Orange County, and so she kind of lived on the fringes of some of the nicer places, and and the wealth and everything. And so it totally makes sense that she would be interested in this scene, and that she would be connected with people that are part of this culture, and then also that she would be not very judgmental about it, that she would be interested in just showing this is what's happening, these are who these people are, letting them tell their own stories and control their own narratives in a way, and then just letting it be, because her interest isn't in celebrating or condemning anything. It's in just showing people this is what this is.
Well, that's the thing. It's showing people, because you've got this. So like you're saying, you're in a time period where these are frightening people. It's like, oh, stay away from them. They're scary, right? And this film definitely humanizes. It shows them the fact that these are kids. These are like, people, human beings, right? And
by the way, I guarantee my mom did not watch this movie.
Well, it's interesting because the chief of the LAPD in 1981 basically wrote a letter insisting that this film never be exhibited again in Los Angeles.
Let's talk about that for just a brief second. So the police chief at the time was Daryl Gates, who finally retired in 1992 after the LA riots, when Rodney King had been beaten, and then the police officers were the four white officers who did it were found not guilty, and then there were riots in LA, and so Daryl Gates was still the police chief all through that time. And at the time that he finally retired, left the department, there were all kinds of things that came out about, just racial issues, and just the way that the LAPD had handled things, had handled themselves throughout the 80s. And so looking at him trying to stamp out this movie and trying to make sure nobody saw this movie in 1981 completely tracks that he was the police chief at the time.
Well, and it's also like it's so predictable in a lot of ways because it's not a distance film. Like you're very up close and personal with these bands and these people, etc. But it is very much just like let them talk. You know, you as I say, you hear Spheeris's voice sometimes, but most of the questions that she's asking are just like, can you say more about that? Right? Like why do you wear this? And just, what did the tattoos mean? Things like that. And what she's doing ultimately is, as far as possible, she's representing a thing that's happening. So, whether or not you like it, don't like it, you support it, you don't support it, you think these kids are a bunch of thugs who should be annihilated, all this is a real thing that is going on in Los Angeles and across the country in a lot of ways. And there's a reason for that, right? Why are these kids acting like this? Just like, well, why are they acting like this?
Exactly.
Let's talk about it. This is reality. And and it's not surprising that the cops would be like, we don't want people to see this. We don't want people to think about what is happening in Los Angeles, that this whole thing actually exists. So it makes perfect sense. And I think the fact that Spheeris is as distanced as a documentary filmmaker can be, in terms of just sort of asking questions and being like, tell me about, why you're into this. And kind of letting the people talk and not judging them on it is very frightening in a certain sense, because it's like, this is a reality that people are living and you need to look at it.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the music a little bit, because I am someone, I like a lot of punk rock. Different kinds. I love the Dead Kennedys. I like Black Flag a lot. And the variation. I love X, by the way. The band X, and the performances really do vary because you get people that like can't play their instruments for shit.
Yeah.
And
don't care. They'll go out on stage anyway.
That's part of the point. Like, there's so much in punk that is about like, it's that desire to be so anti-establishment that you're literally talking about people who cannot play guitar, playing guitar on stage and screaming. And that's like what gets people going. But then you get other bands like X, where if you actually listen to their chord changes and their lyrics and their voices, it's just like, it's very deliberate. They're actually very good musicians. And so there's this huge kind of spectrum of performances and people who are doing this kind of music for a lot of different reasons. And most of them are saying like, you also have that kind of contrast between when you're making art where the point is you can't make money off of it, like the whole aesthetic is not making money. What happens when you actually start making money? Like what happens when you're no longer have to live in squats? And there's like this back and forth that kind of gets going. And some of the interviews with X, they kind of start with that, where it's like, they have a song called, I think, Desperate. And just like, what happens when we're not desperate anymore? When we're like actually earning enough money to live?
Then they get called sellouts, and everybody turns on them, and then their whole fan base changes.
Well, that's the thing, is the whole street art aesthetic. At some level, it's like graffiti artists who become famous for being graffiti artists, and then the whole point of street art and public art is that one, it's a reaction to something. It's a reaction to the cops, the government, people, right? And it's free. It's for the city. It's for other people. And as soon as you cross that line of like, well, now you're not destitute,
right?
You're no longer doing it right,
Yeah. I think that's one of the interesting things is this whole idea, this whole movement is supposed to be about individuality and, and letting people just be themselves. And yet when people start to be successful for being themselves, then they're no longer individuals. Then they're part of the establishment that you're supposedly fighting against. At least that's the idea. So I don't know.
What do you think of the music as someone who's not majorly into punk?
Some of it I was like, ooh, I kind of dig this. And like the screaming stuff, I was just like, oh, turn it down, turn it down.
Turn it down.
But overall it was fun to just but overall it was just fun to listen to things that I it's funny because I used to very much be very set in I only listened to certain people, certain types of music, and now it's like I listen to everything. I'm so much more open. And so even if it's something I don't necessarily like, I'm always interested in hearing different sounds and yeah. So I enjoyed being exposed to that. So yeah.
Cool. So the title of the film, The Decline of Western Civilization, it's not clear where it actually comes from. It may be a reference to a review of a Stooges album, in which the writer quoted a friend who called the popularity of the Stooges as indicative of the decline of Western civilization. That's Iggy Pop, by the way, as the Stooges. And that's kind of like slightly earlier than what this film is looking at. And I think that's one of the interesting things here is that Spheeris doesn't give a lot of background about like it's not like a historical film in the sense that where we're going to look at the rise of punk and how it results in this. It is very much a snapshot of a period, for whatever that means. And so you get earlier groups that are more coming out of the acid rock of the 1970s. You get groups that are closer to stuff like rockabilly, but you have all of these different subcultures that are kind of feeding into this, and then this like constant sort of attitude of everything sucks. Like even the bands you love suck. You hate them. You hate the bands. You scream at the bands. You try to climb up on stage and beat people up. And I'm fascinated that the film actually ends with probably one of the angriest, in a certain sense, performances by Fear, right? Which involves them screaming racist and homophobic and sexist slurs at their audience.
Yeah.
In LA, talking about how great it is that they're from San Francisco and they're telling their audience to fuck off and all this. This is like a common thing in the punk rock scene in this period of bands literally just abusing their audience. And that's what the audience wants. That's what they like. They're into it. And you've got like, people trying to get up on stage to hit them and to fight them and getting knocked back down.
That's just a fun Saturday night. What?
Well, it is this question, and that's the question that runs throughout the film in a lot of ways, is at what point is it a performance? Right. At what point is it reality? At what point is it dancing? And at what point is it fighting? And it blurs the lines so much. And the film doesn't really give an answer to it. It's just there. It's like this force.
Yeah. I think she doesn't give an answer because there isn't an answer.
Yeah. In some ways it's very inexplicable. It's inexplicable, but it's understandable given what is being expressed by a lot of these people, which is that everybody's forgotten about us. No one gives a shit about us. And in a certain sense, so why should we give a shit about ourselves?
Right. Gen X in a movie.
Well, and it's interesting because then if you go on and watch the documentary about heavy metal, which is very fascinating in a lot of ways if you know that Penelope Spheeris later directs Wayne's World like a couple years later. So it's an interesting kind of confluence of where things are going for her. But if you go on and watch that documentary, the way that the heavy metal scene is represented is very much about superficiality and aesthetic and almost nothing else. Like
Hmm.
it feels, and again, I don't know enough about the heavy metal scene from that period to really be able to say whether that's accurate or if she's like if there's some misrepresentation going on. But the film comes off as this story about a rock movement that has absolutely no depth to it, that is
Interesting.
solely about the aesthetic.
I feel like I'm more aware of that time period than this one. So I definitely want to go in and finish the trilogy. And I'll be curious. I'll be curious to watch the heavy metal one because yeah.
Yeah, let me know what
Not
you
that I was
think.
like big and not that I was a big metalhead when I was like 8 years old, but you know what I mean? Like I feel like
You're in a
I feel like
headbanger. Come on. You're a little headbanger at the age of 7. Come on. You
you
totally were.
know that started when I was 15 and Wayne's World came out.
See, I became a headbanger when Wayne's World came out. I was about that age. But that was several years later.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
yeah, it's we're like Alia said, all 3 of the films I think are really worth watching. The final film, which is really less focused on the music and more on the lifestyle, which is about the gutter punk lifestyle, and that's late 90s. So much closer actually to it's still a little bit older than me, but it's closer to my generation.
Mhm.
And that is very much goes into like just the lifestyle that these kids are living. Um and there's a lot of I think that there's a great deal of sympathy and a lot of understanding that goes into it as well. It's a really interesting film.
Oh.
The next film that Spheeris makes is Suburbia, which in 1983, which is about punk rockers, punks in the 1980s, and is kind of a fictionalization of that sort of the social side of punk rock and of these kids who are kind of living on the fringes of society. It is the film that we will
Hmm.
talk about next when we come back.
Awesome.
So, any other thoughts about the decline of Western civilization?
um so many, but I can't think of anything that we haven't really covered. So it's good.
Is
Watch it.
is this the decline of Western civilization? Is this kind of like the falling apart of the
This
American
is where
dream?
it all started. No, I don't think this is the decline. I think this is a reflection of the fact that our American dream was in decline, but I don't think that was necessarily a bad thing. I
Yeah.
think this is more about just, people realizing that the American dream isn't real and it isn't really attainable for most people.
Mhm. I do like some of the interviews with the older people who like run the venues and stuff who are like trying to figure out, they're like one guy is obviously very hostile to the whole thing, but is, saying like, well, we don't want violence. And then like his head of security or like some manager or something is going like, well, but that's what this is. Like you're hiring these bands to come here. So if you hire these bands, this is what you're gonna get,
Hmm.
And then some of the others who are just like, oh, it's just sort of dancing. It's a bit weird, but the kids seem to like it,
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think that will close us out for this week. The all 3 of the Decline of Western Civilization films are available on Criterion. I really encourage people to watch all of them. They're fascinating movies, and and it's interesting then looking at Spheeris, who goes on to be a writer on Roseanne for a little while. Does make Wayne's World, which we're going to talk about later on this month. Very much looking forward to that.
Hmm.
And also makes like the Beverly Hillbillies,
Yeah.
a film which I adore, but is such an odd. It's so odd in so many ways.
It feels like a weird choice in her filmography, and I have some questions about how that happened.
Me too. But so when we come back, we're going to take a little bit of a break next week, but then after that, we are going to come back and talk about Suburbia, which is her first fictional feature film.
And it's available on Peacock and Prime.
Yes, and it is a very good film as well. I'm going to be interested to discuss that, particularly in context with Decline of Western Civilization. So I think that is going to close us out for this week. And as always, we want to thank our wonderful patrons who include Abby, Audra, Brian, Connor, Estefania, Ferdinand, Heather, James, Judy, Carriata, Matt, Michelle, Monty, Nanina, Noel, Robert, Steve, and Sharon. Thank you so much for continuing to support us, guys. And we will be having more bonus episodes coming out very, very soon. We are slowly working our way through all of the Alfred Hitchcock directed episodes of Alfred Hitchcock Presents. So I think
slowly, we're doing it at a normal pace.
it's not slow. I'm sorry, I just said slowly because that's what I said. And coming up on the next one is, I think, the Case of Mr. Pelham, which
Yes.
is an interesting episode. So definitely check that out. And if you want to become a member of our Patreon, we are patreon.com/Citizen Dame. You get access to those bonus episodes, which also include our Flag Means Death episodes, and some fun buttons and stickers, and also getting to support us and keep the lights on for us. We also have a Ko-Fi, ko-fi.com/Citizen Dame, if you want to throw a couple of bucks at us. It sounded horrible. And of course, we
Throw
have
it at us and attack us on stage.
Please don't. Not that far into the punk scene, I gotta say. It's like, oh, that's very violent. Please leave me alone. And of course, we have our
Like
website.
we would ever get on a stage.
Never. Well, see, I'm a drummer, so like I would be the one who would be the most protected, to be honest.
I'm sorry. Hold on. What? We've been podcasting together for 7.5 years, and I did not know this about you.
You didn't know I was a drummer? Yeah. I was a drummer don't really do it much anymore, but yeah, drummer since second grade, actually.
What?
Like, yeah.
This is brand new information. I'm not even kidding.
Jazz and rock drumming. I've got a bunch of hand drums, just like, yeah. I never told you that?
Gosh.
Okay.
No. Wow, that's so cool. Well, you're a drummer. I'm a singer.
See, we just need a guitarist. We just need a guitarist. Like someone got to play guitar, maybe bass. Like,
do they have to play though, or just get out there and play? Like, do they have to really learn their instrument?
Not really. Like, we just need someone who could hold a guitar and strum it.
Exactly.
You can be a punk rock singer.
Perfect.
Karen, sounds good. Anyways, our website is citizendamepod.com, where you can read.
See, this
reviews.
is why you listen to the end. You never know what random stuff we're gonna say.
Exactly. You can read reviews there, and all sorts of other interesting things that I know that Karen has been doing some more stuff there, and we should have some more stuff coming up soon as well. You could also get in touch with us if you have like questions about punk rock, my drumming career, how Karen is going to be a punk rock singer. That's citizendamepod@gmail.com. And of course, we are on the various socials. We are on Instagram and Blue Sky at Citizen Dame Pod, and we are on Letterboxd at Citizen Dame. And you can get in touch with us individually. Karen, where are you?
I am on Instagram, Letterboxd, and Blue Sky at Karen M. Peterson.
And I'm on Instagram and Letterboxd at LH Business. And we will talk to y'all in a week.
Yeah. Bye.
I'm very good at hiding my feelings, so I don't feel depression anymore. It's easy for me not to do that. It's easy to be very detached.
Well, my mother's dad, so my stepdad, he's a cop. I haven't talked to him in a long time. Seen him at the movies one night. He didn't talk to me, he walked away. Acted like he didn't know me.
I don't know where my parents are.
Where's your real father?
Don't know. Don't even know who he is. Society stinks.